When you look up at the ceiling of a very old building, you probably don't stop to think about it. It's just there. It has always been there. And for most people, it stays in the background, noticed briefly, then forgotten. A small number of researchers, historians, and independent observers have begun paying much closer attention. They are asking a question that sounds simple at first. How were these ceilings actually made? Not the general idea, not the broad history, the specific process, the actual construction, the tools used, the conditions under which the work was carried out. And the more carefully that question is examined, the more something begins to feel slightly off. This is not a feeling based on nothing. It comes from looking at the details. The ceilings in question are found in buildings that are hundreds of years old. Some are even older. And what makes them unusual is not just their age. It is the precision of what is on them. The patterns are not rough or approximate. They are detailed, measured, and consistent. In many cases, identical geometric forms repeat across an entire ceiling without visible error. Curved sections connect to straight sections without gaps. Layers of decoration are placed at heights that make the work extremely difficult to carry out, and yet the results look as if the conditions were completely controlled. That level of precision is not common in old construction. Old buildings show their age. Walls lean slightly. Floors settle unevenly. Repairs are visible over time. But some of these ceilings, despite being centuries old, look almost untouched. Not in the sense that they are perfectly preserved, but in the sense that the original work itself appears to have been carried out with a degree of accuracy that feels unusual for the time period. And this is where it becomes unclear. The tools available to builders of that era were basic. Chisels, wooden frames, ropes, pulleys, hand-carved molds. These are not instruments of fine precision, and yet the results suggest otherwise. The official record does not describe anything unusual about how these ceilings were built. According to mainstream history, skilled craftsmen using the tools of their time produced these results through training, experience, and organized effort. That explanation is not unreasonable on the surface. But when you compare the tools described in the historical record with the results visible in the structures themselves, a small gap appears. Not a large gap. Not an obvious contradiction. Just a quiet difference that is difficult to fully close with the standard explanation alone. It's also worth thinking about the environment in which this work was done. Many of these ceilings are located high above the floor. Some are 30 feet up. Some are significantly higher. Working at that height on wooden scaffolding, in limited natural light, with no electric tools, no laser levels, no precise measurement instruments. That is a significant challenge. And in those conditions, producing work that is both highly detailed and highly consistent across a large surface area is not something that happens easily. It requires not just skill, but a system, a reliable, repeatable method that produces the same result every time. And this raises questions. What was that system? Where is the evidence of it? Why is it not described in more detail in the records that survive? At first, this might seem like a minor point. Many ancient techniques were passed down through practice rather than written instruction. Builders learned by doing. Knowledge was held in the hands of craftsmen, not in books. So the absence of written records for every step of the process is not surprising. That is a fair point. But there is still a problem. When techniques are passed down through practice over generations, they leave traces. You can see the early versions, which are usually less refined. You can observe the gradual improvement. You can track the development of a skill over time. In some of these ceiling traditions, that developmental trail is not clearly visible. The early examples are already highly refined, and that doesn't fully make sense. This issue has been noted quietly by a number of researchers who study ancient construction methods. They are not claiming anything extraordinary. They are simply observing that the standard explanation, skilled workers, basic tools, long periods of time, does not account for every detail visible in the structures. There are specific aspects of the work that remain poorly explained, and those aspects tend to be the ones involving the finest precision and the greatest structural consistency. The parts that should be hardest to produce are often the parts that show the least evidence of difficulty. Now consider something else. These ceilings do not appear in just one place. They are not the product of one culture, one region, or one historical period. Similar ceiling types, with similar levels of precision, similar geometric complexity, and similar structural characteristics, appear in very different parts of the world. You find them in the great cathedrals of Europe. You find them in the mosques and palaces of the Islamic world. You find them in ancient temples across the Indian subcontinent. You find them in structures across Central Asia, North Africa, and parts of East Asia. Each of these regions developed its own architectural tradition. Each had its own materials, its own labor systems, and its own design philosophy. And yet, the results share qualities that are difficult to fully explain through independent development alone. Some believe this is simply the result of parallel thinking. When builders face similar structural problems, they sometimes arrive at similar solutions. A ceiling needs to support its own weight. It needs to direct that weight toward the walls and columns below. And the most efficient shapes for doing that tend to look similar regardless of where they are developed. That is a reasonable explanation for some of the similarities, but it does not explain all of them. Some of the similarities go beyond structural logic. They involve decorative choices, proportional relationships, and geometric systems that do not follow from engineering necessity alone. And that is where the parallel development explanation starts to weaken. It is also worth noting that some of these structures were built during periods when contact between distant regions was limited. Trade routes existed, of course. Ideas and materials moved across long distances even in the ancient world. But the depth of technical knowledge required to produce these ceilings is not something that travels easily. It is not like a decorative motif that can be copied from a drawing. It requires an understanding of geometry, material behavior, and construction sequencing. Sharing that kind of knowledge across great distances, in a time before printed manuals or standardized education, would have required sustained contact and organized transmission. The evidence for that kind of contact, in many of these cases, is not clearly established. This raises questions about how we understand the spread of technical knowledge in the ancient and medieval world. The conventional view is that most advanced construction techniques develop locally and spread slowly through trade and migration. That view explains a great deal, but it struggles to account for the speed at which certain ceiling types appear to have spread, and for the consistency of precision across regions that had only indirect contact with each other. Some researchers have pointed to this as evidence that knowledge was moving through channels that are not well documented. Others disagree and prefer to stay within the conventional framework. The debate has not been resolved. What is also interesting is the reaction, or rather, the lack of reaction, that these observations tend to produce in mainstream academic circles. The questions being raised here are not new. Researchers have been pointing to specific construction details in ancient ceilings for decades. Papers have been published. Measurements have been taken. Comparisons have been made. And yet, the mainstream historical explanation has not significantly changed. The gaps are acknowledged in small ways, sometimes in footnotes, sometimes in technical appendices, but they are rarely addressed directly or at length. This doesn't fully make sense if the explanation is as complete as it is presented to be. That silence in itself is worth noting, not because silence always means something is hidden. In research, silence often simply means that something is not considered important enough to debate publicly. But when the same gaps appear repeatedly in studies from different institutions in different countries, and those gaps continue to receive only indirect acknowledgement, it becomes harder to dismiss the pattern as unimportant. Something about these ceilings is consistently difficult to explain, and that difficulty has been consistently understated. There is also a practical observation that several craftsmen and conservation specialists have made when working on restoration projects involving these old ceilings. When they attempt to replicate even a small section of the original work, using methods and tools appropriate to the historical period, the results consistently fall short of the original in terms of consistency and precision. The replicated sections are recognizable as similar, but they are not identical in quality. The originals are more even, more consistent, more precisely aligned, and this is where the explanation becomes difficult. If the original builders worked under worse conditions with simpler tools, why is their work harder to replicate than expected? This question has no clean answer in the current historical record. Researchers have suggested that the original builders may have had techniques that were simply not recorded, or that were recorded in documents that no longer exist. Others suggest that the number of workers involved was much larger than estimated, allowing for more careful checking and correction of errors. Still others point to the possibility that restoration specialists are not fully trained in the original methods, and that true replication would require years of specific practice. These are all possible explanations, but none of them has been demonstrated clearly enough to close the gap entirely. And so the question remains open. These ceilings exist. They are old. They are precise. They appear across multiple cultures and regions. They show a level of consistency that is difficult to fully account for using the tools and conditions described in the official record. The explanation that has been given is reasonable, but it is not complete. Small gaps remain. Patterns of inconsistency persist. And the more closely these structures are examined, the more those gaps become visible. This is not a conclusion. It is a starting point, because what we have looked at so far is only the surface, the visible part of a much larger set of questions. And those questions go deeper than most people expect. The accepted explanation for these ceilings is not complicated. It is, in fact, quite straightforward. According to mainstream historians and architectural scholars, these structures were built by skilled human craftsmen who worked with the tools available to them at the time. The process was slow. It was organized, and it was carried out over long periods by teams of trained workers who understood their craft deeply. This is the official position, and it is presented with the reasonable degree of confidence in most historical literature. At first, it seems like a complete answer. But the more carefully it is examined, the more certain details begin to require closer attention. The foundation of this explanation rests on a simple idea. Human skill, developed over generations, is capable of producing remarkable results even with basic tools. This is not a difficult idea to accept. History is full of examples of extraordinary human craftsmanship achieved under difficult conditions. Ancient pottery, metalwork, textile production, and stone-cutting all demonstrate that early civilizations were capable of precision and complexity long before modern technology existed. So when historians say that these ceilings were the product of skilled hands and patient effort, they are drawing on a broader principle that is well supported by evidence across many fields. That much is fair. The tools most commonly associated with this kind of ceiling construction include chisels of various sizes, wooden molds used to shape plaster or set stone, ropes and pulley systems for lifting materials, and wooden scaffolding to allow workers to reach high surfaces. These were not crude instruments. In the hands of experienced craftsmen, they were capable of producing detailed and consistent results. Historians point to surviving examples of similar tools found at archaeological sites near old construction zones. Some of these tools are remarkably well preserved. They tell us something about what was available, but they do not always tell us exactly how the finest details were achieved with them. That part of the process is less clearly documented. One of the strongest supports for the official explanation is the existence of written records. In several architectural traditions, manuals and instructional texts survive that describe how buildings were designed and constructed. These documents vary in detail and in the depth of technical information they provide, but their existence is significant. They show that building knowledge was organized, recorded, and transmitted in a deliberate way. It was not simply passed from hand to hand without structure. There was a system, and that system, according to historians, is what allowed complex ceiling work to be carried out consistently across large projects and long time frames. This raises a question, though. If the system was so well documented, why do certain construction details remain unexplained even in those texts? In medieval Europe, the construction of large cathedral ceilings was carried out primarily by stonemasons. These were not casual workers. They were trained professionals who spent years learning their trade, often beginning as apprentices in their early teenage years. The stonemason guilds of medieval Europe are well documented. They had their own rules, their own knowledge traditions, and their own standards of quality. Work was inspected. Errors were corrected. Projects were supervised by master builders who understood the structural and decorative requirements of the work. The guild system provided a framework that made large-scale precision work possible. That is the accepted view. But this is where it becomes unclear. The guild records that survive describe the organization of labor in general terms. They rarely describe the specific techniques used to achieve the finest levels of precision in ceiling work. That technical detail is largely absent. In the Islamic architectural world, a specific ceiling form known as muqarnas represents one of the most complex examples of this kind of work. Muqarnas are three-dimensional geometric structures that hang from ceilings and arches in layered, honeycomb-like formations. They appear in mosques, palaces, and madrasas across Persia, the Arab world, North Africa, and Spain. Historians explain that muqarnas were designed using advanced geometric principles that were taught in schools of architecture and passed down through generations of builders. Geometric drawings used to plan muqarnas designs have been found in medieval manuscripts, and some of these drawings show a sophisticated understanding of spatial geometry. This is impressive, but the drawings describe the design. They do not always fully describe the construction process, how individual three-dimensional pieces were produced and fitted together at height with the consistency that the finished structures display. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. In India, the situation is somewhat different. Ancient Hindu and Jain temples contain ceiling carvings of extraordinary detail. Entire ceilings are covered in figures, patterns, and geometric forms that were carved directly into stone. The texts that guided this work, collectively known as the Shilpa Shastras, are among the most detailed ancient architectural manuals known to exist. They specify measurements, proportions, and the symbolic meaning of different design elements. They describe what should be built and how large each element should be. What they describe less clearly is the practical method of execution, how a carver working at height, in limited light, managed to produce work of the consistency visible in the finished ceilings. The Shilpa Shastras are a record of intent and proportion. They are not a complete record of technique. And that gap is worth noting. Historians are generally comfortable with this gap. They point out that much of the practical knowledge in ancient and medieval craft traditions was never written down. It lived in the hands and eyes of the craftsmen themselves. Apprentices learned by watching and doing. A master carver did not write down how to hold a chisel at a particular angle. He showed his student. That student then showed his own student. Over generations, knowledge accumulated and refined itself through practice. This is a convincing explanation for many aspects of traditional craft. It accounts for the absence of written technical detail without suggesting that the knowledge didn't exist. But it does leave one persistent question open. If the knowledge was transmitted only through practice, and if those practitioners are no longer alive, then the exact method is effectively lost. And if the method is lost, how confident can we be that the official explanation is fully accurate? This question becomes more pointed when you consider the scale of some of these projects. A cathedral ceiling is not a small surface. Neither is the interior of a large mosque or a temple assembly hall. These are vast surfaces, sometimes spanning hundreds of square meters, decorated with patterns that must remain consistent from one end to the other. Coordinating that kind of work across a large team, over a period of years, using methods passed down through practice rather than precise written instruction, that is a complex organizational challenge. Historians acknowledge this. They point to evidence of project management in some surviving records, but the details of how consistency was maintained across such large surfaces and across such long construction periods are not always clearly established. At first, the explanation seems to cover it, but there is a problem with leaving it at that. There is also the question of time. The official explanation consistently emphasizes that these ceilings were built slowly, over long periods, years, sometimes decades, of continuous work by large teams. This framing is used to make the results seem more achievable. Given enough time and enough workers, even very complex work becomes possible with simple tools. That logic is reasonable, but the timelines recorded in historical sources are not always consistent with the physical evidence. Some structures show evidence of having been completed more quickly than the recorded timelines suggest, and when the physical evidence and the written record don't match, it raises questions about which one to trust more and why. The official explanation also tends to treat each ceiling tradition separately. European cathedral ceilings are explained through the guild system. Islamic makarnas are explained through geometric schools. Indian temple ceilings are explained through the Shilpa Shastras. Each tradition is given its own framework, and within each framework, the explanation is reasonable. But this approach of treating each case separately means that the cross-cultural similarities, the shared precision, the shared geometric logic, the shared structural consistency, are rarely addressed as a connected phenomenon. Some believe this separation is appropriate, since each tradition is genuinely distinct. Others disagree, and argue that the similarities point to something that a tradition-by-tradition explanation misses. That disagreement has not been resolved. It is also worth noting how the official explanation handles the question of failed attempts. In any field where skill is developed through practice, there are failures. Early attempts are less successful. Techniques are refined in response to what doesn't work. The record of failure is as informative as the record of success. In some ceiling traditions, evidence of early, less refined versions is present. You can see the skill developing. But in other cases, the early examples are already highly accomplished. The developmental record is thin or absent, and this is where the explanation becomes difficult. A skill that appears already developed at its earliest known stage is harder to explain through gradual refinement than one that shows a clear learning curve. None of this is to say that the official explanation is wrong. It is not. It is grounded in evidence. It is supported by surviving documents, surviving tools, and the testimony of researchers who have spent careers studying these structures. The broad strokes of the explanation, skilled craftsmen, organized labor, advanced geometric knowledge, long construction periods, are almost certainly correct. The question is not whether these elements were part of the process. The question is whether they are sufficient to explain everything that is visible in the finished structures. That is a quieter and more specific question than a direct challenge to the official view. It is not about disproving anything. It is about identifying the places where the explanation, as currently presented, leaves room for further inquiry. Those places exist. They have been noted by researchers working within mainstream institutions. They appear in technical studies, conservation reports, and architectural analyses. They are not widely discussed in popular histories of these buildings, but they are there, and they are consistent enough across different structures and different traditions to suggest that the official explanation, while largely accurate, may not be the complete picture. This is where the investigation needs to go next, not by rejecting what is established, but by looking more carefully at the points where the established explanation grows thin. The craftsmen were real. The tools were real. The knowledge was real. But something about how all of those elements came together to produce these specific results, with this specific level of precision, this specific degree of cross-cultural consistency, and this specific absence of a clear developmental trail in some cases, has not been fully accounted for. And until it is, the official explanation remains a strong but incomplete answer to a question that is still, in certain important ways, open. The first doubt that arises when studying these old ceilings is not a doubt about the people who built them. That point needs to be stated clearly from the beginning. The craftsmen who worked on these structures were skilled. They were trained. They understood their materials and their tools. The historical record, incomplete as it is in places, does support the idea that organized and experienced labor was involved in constructing these buildings. That part of the explanation is not being questioned here. What is being questioned is something more specific, something that sits just underneath the surface of the accepted account. It is the question of consistency. How did workers, operating under genuinely difficult physical conditions, produce results that are so even, so precise, and so free of visible error across such large and complex surfaces? This distinction matters. It shifts the focus away from whether the craftsmen were capable, and toward something that is harder to explain: the quality of the outcome relative to the conditions under which it was produced. In most areas of craft and construction, there is a relationship between working conditions and result quality. Better conditions generally produce more consistent results. Worse conditions introduce more variation, more error, more visible correction. That relationship is observable across many fields and many historical periods. And it is this relationship that makes certain aspects of these old ceilings worth examining more carefully. Start with the most basic physical challenge: height. Many of the ceilings being discussed here are not low surfaces close to the floor. They are located high above the ground. 30 feet is common. 40 feet is not unusual. In some of the larger structures, certain cathedral naves, certain temple mandapas, certain palace reception halls, the ceiling height reaches 50 or 60 feet above the floor level. That is a significant distance. Standing at the base of such a space and looking upward, the ceiling can seem almost unreachably far away. And yet, that is where the finest and most detailed work is located. Not on the lower walls, not near the floor. Up there, far above the ground, where reaching the surface at all requires a substantial structure just to stand on. The scaffolding used for this work was made of wood. In some regions, bamboo was used. These were functional structures, but they were not rigid in the way that modern metal scaffolding is. They moved slightly under the weight of workers. They flexed when tools were applied with force. Working on a surface while standing on a platform that responds to your movements introduces a level of instability that has a direct effect on the precision of the work. And this is where it becomes unclear. If the platform was slightly unstable, and the surface was far above the ground, and the tools were operated entirely by hand, how was the level of precision in the finished work consistently maintained across such large areas? Light is another factor that deserves attention. These ceilings were not constructed under electric lighting. Natural light, in a large enclosed space, does not reach the ceiling surface evenly. Higher up, the light becomes dimmer and more indirect. Workers operating near the ceiling surface would have been working in conditions where seeing fine detail clearly was genuinely difficult. Oil lamps and candles could provide some supplementary light, but they produce a flickering, uneven illumination that is not ideal for precision work. The quality of visibility at the working surface would have varied depending on the time of day, the season, and the number of light sources available. None of these conditions support the kind of consistent, detailed output that these ceilings display. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. Consider also the nature of the patterns themselves. Many of these ceiling designs are geometric. They involve repeating forms, circles, polygons, interlocking stars, radiating grids that must connect precisely at every junction point. If one element is slightly off, the error compounds. By the time the pattern reaches the other side of the ceiling, a small early mistake can produce a significant misalignment. Managing that kind of accumulated error across a large ceiling surface while working at height, in limited light, with hand tools, requires a system of measurement and checking that is both reliable and consistently applied. Some such systems certainly existed, but the specific methods used in each tradition are not always clearly documented, and how effectively they controlled error across entire ceiling surfaces is not always possible to verify from the surviving record alone. What makes this observation more significant is the actual quality of the finished work. These ceilings do not show the kind of accumulated error that the conditions suggest should be present. The symmetry holds across the full width and length of the surface. Repeating elements align correctly at every junction. The spacing between decorative forms is consistent. The depth of carving or the thickness of applied decoration is even. In structures that have been studied in detail by conservation specialists, measurements of these features consistently show a level of regularity that is not easily explained by the working conditions described in the historical record. At first, it seems normal, but there is a problem. The conditions and the results do not match as cleanly as the official explanation implies. This observation has come not just from historians or theorists, but from working craftsmen. Specifically, from the people who have attempted to replicate sections of these ceilings as part of conservation and restoration projects. These are trained professionals. In some cases, they are among the most skilled practitioners of traditional techniques alive today. They work with appropriate historical materials, the same types of stone, plaster, or wood used in the originals. They study the existing work carefully before attempting to reproduce it, and they work in conditions that are, in most respects, significantly better than those available to the original builders. They have stable, adjustable platforms. They have consistent, controllable lighting. They have precise measuring instruments. They have access to photographic documentation that allows them to check their work against the original at every stage. And yet, the results of these replication attempts consistently fall short of the original work in terms of precision and consistency. The replicated sections are recognizable as similar. The patterns are correct. The general appearance is close. But close examination reveals differences in the regularity of spacing, the evenness of carving depth, and the accuracy of alignment that distinguish the replicated work from the original. The originals are more consistent, more even, more precisely aligned. This finding has been noted in several conservation reports, and it raises a question that the official explanation does not easily answer. If trained modern craftsmen, working under better conditions with more precise instruments, produce results that are less consistent than the originals, what does that say about how the originals were actually made? Some believe the answer lies in the sheer amount of practice the original craftsmen had. They argue that builders who spent their entire lives on a single type of work, starting from childhood, developed a level of physical intuition and muscle memory that modern craftsmen simply do not possess. That is a fair point. Specialized, lifelong practice does produce extraordinary results. There are traditional crafts in various parts of the world today where practitioners achieve results that seem almost impossible until you understand the depth of their training. So the practice argument cannot be dismissed. But others disagree with it as a complete explanation. They point out that even with extreme specialization, working conditions still affect output quality. A highly practiced craftsman still works less precisely on an unstable platform in poor light than on a stable surface in good light. The conditions matter. And in these cases, the conditions were not ideal. There is another aspect of this that is worth examining. When modern craftsmen attempt to replicate these ceilings, they typically work on small sections, a square meter, perhaps 2 or 3 square meters at most. Even at that scale, the work takes significant time, days or weeks for a single small section, depending on the complexity of the design. Now consider the full scale of the original ceilings. Some of these surfaces cover hundreds of square meters. The entire surface, at the same level of detail and the same degree of precision, was completed as part of a single construction project. Scaling the replication effort up to match the original scope produces numbers that are difficult to reconcile with the historical record in terms of time, labor, and the maintenance of consistent quality across such a large area. The explanation does not fully account for the scale of the achievement. The height factor also interacts with the replication problem in a specific way. When craftsmen attempt to replicate ceiling work at ground level or on low platforms, the work is already difficult. But when they attempt it at height, on scaffolding that is closer to the original working conditions, the difficulty increases noticeably. Balance, tool control, and visibility all become more challenging at height. The quality of the work produced at height, even by skilled craftsmen using modern equipment, tends to be measurably less consistent than work produced at ground level. This finding reinforces the original question. The original builders worked at height. Their conditions were worse, and their results were better. That doesn't fully make sense within the framework of the standard explanation. It is important to note that this is not a claim that the official explanation is completely wrong. The broad account, skilled craftsmen, organized teams, long construction periods, advanced geometric knowledge, is almost certainly correct in its general outline. The doubt here is specific. It concerns the gap between the conditions described and the quality of the results observed. That gap is not enormous. It is not impossible to bridge, but it has not been bridged convincingly in the existing literature. The specific mechanisms by which these workers maintained such consistent precision, at such heights, under such conditions, over such large areas, have not been fully demonstrated. They have been assumed, and assumption is not the same as explanation. This matters because the ceilings themselves are physical objects. They can be measured. They can be analyzed. The precision in them is not a matter of interpretation. It is a matter of record. And when the measurable quality of the finished work is placed alongside the documented working conditions, and the gap between the two is examined carefully, the official explanation begins to show its limits, not in a way that overturns it, but in a way that leaves room for further questions. The craftsmen were skilled. The organization was real. The effort was genuine. But something about how the final results consistently exceed what the conditions should have reliably produced remains, at this point, not fully explained. And that gap, quiet, specific, and persistent, is the first place where the accepted account begins to weaken. To understand the full scale of what is being examined here, it helps to step back and look at the broader picture. Not just one building, not just one ceiling, not just one culture or one historical period. Because when you do that, when you pull back far enough to see the whole landscape, something becomes visible that individual examples alone do not reveal. These ceilings, with their precision and their complexity, are not isolated occurrences. They appear across a wide range of places, traditions, and centuries. And the fact that they appear so widely is itself something worth examining carefully. Begin with Europe. The Gothic cathedrals of France, England, and Germany contain some of the most studied ceiling work in the world. These are large stone structures, many of them built between the 12th and 15th centuries. Their ceilings, vaulted, ribbed, and in some cases covered with carved stone decoration, have been analyzed by architects and historians for generations. The fan vaulting found in certain English cathedrals is particularly well known. It involves stone ribs that spread outward from central points in a pattern that resembles an open fan, repeated across the entire ceiling surface. The geometric consistency of these patterns, across surfaces that span hundreds of square meters, is a feature that even specialists find impressive. And yet, this is only one tradition among several. Move eastward and the picture expands significantly. In Iran, the ceiling work found in medieval mosques and palaces represents a completely different tradition with its own distinct visual language. The Makarnas structures already mentioned in earlier discussion appear here in some of their most elaborate forms. But beyond Makarnas, Iranian architecture also features flat and shallow domed ceilings covered in geometric tile work and plaster carving of extraordinary complexity. The city of Isfahan alone contains multiple structures where ceiling work of this caliber has survived for centuries. Moving further west into Morocco and Spain, the same general tradition continues, adapted to local materials and preferences, but maintaining the same underlying commitment to geometric precision and decorative density. This raises questions about how a tradition of such technical depth maintained its consistency across such a vast geographic area over such a long period. Then there's India. The temple architecture of the Indian subcontinent represents yet another entirely distinct ceiling tradition. In the carved stone temples of Rajasthan, Gujarat, Karnataka, and Tamil Nadu, ceiling work takes the form of deeply carved stone panels, often circular in composition, featuring concentric rings of figures, flowers, and geometric forms that decrease in scale as they move toward a central point. Some of these carved ceiling panels are among the most densely detailed stone surfaces produced anywhere in the ancient world. The precision of the carving and the consistency of the compositional system across different temples built in different centuries is a feature that architectural historians have noted repeatedly. It doesn't fully make sense that traditions separated by centuries could maintain such consistent standards without a very well-organized system of transmission. In Ottoman Turkey and across the Balkans, ceiling work appears in a form that blends elements of the Islamic geometric tradition with local decorative preferences. Painted wooden ceilings in Ottoman mosques and civic buildings display elaborate geometric and floral patterns applied with a consistency that mirrors the precision found in the stone and plaster traditions elsewhere. These wooden ceilings are structurally different from stone vaulting or carved stone panels, but they reflect the same underlying organizational principle. Complex geometric systems applied across large surfaces with a high degree of regularity. The fact that this same organizational principle appears in wood, in stone, in plaster, and in tile, across different continents and different centuries, is something that a straightforward parallel development argument does not fully address. Parallel development is the mainstream explanation for these cross-cultural similarities. The basic idea is that when different cultures face similar architectural problems, how to cover a large interior space, how to make that space feel significant and ordered, how to decorate a surface that is visible from far below, they tend to arrive at similar solutions independently. Geometry is universal. The structural logic of arches and vaults follows physical laws that apply equally in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. So it is not surprising, the argument goes, that different traditions arrived at similar-looking results. That explanation is reasonable, and for certain levels of similarity, it is convincing. But this is where it becomes unclear. The parallel development argument works well for broad similarities. It explains why vaulted ceilings appear in multiple traditions. It explains why geometric patterns are common across cultures. It explains why the general visual effect of these ceilings, an ordered, upward drawing surface, is found in many different places. What it explains less well is the specific nature of certain similarities, not the general appearance, but the precise proportional relationships embedded in the designs. When researchers measure the geometric systems in these ceilings and compare the ratios and proportions used across different traditions, they find correspondences that go beyond what independent development would reliably produce. To understand why this matters, consider how geometric systems work in ceiling design. A complex ceiling pattern is not just a collection of shapes arranged attractively. It is built on an underlying mathematical framework, a grid, a set of ratios, a system of proportions that determines where each element is placed and how large it is relative to everything else. Different mathematical frameworks produce distinctly different visual results. If two traditions independently developed their ceiling systems, the underlying mathematical frameworks would be expected to differ, even if the general visual appearance was similar. But in several documented cases, the underlying frameworks match more closely than independent development would predict. And that detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. Some researchers who have studied these proportional correspondences suggest that the similarities reflect a shared mathematical tradition that predates the individual architectural traditions in which they appear. In other words, the geometric principles used in these ceilings may have a common origin that has not been fully identified or documented. Some believe this origin lies in ancient mathematical knowledge that was more widely distributed in the ancient world than the current historical record shows. Others disagree and maintain that the correspondences are either coincidental or the result of gradual cultural contact through trade routes. Neither position has been conclusively established. The debate continues in a relatively quiet corner of architectural history, without reaching a widely accepted resolution. The trade route argument is worth examining briefly. It is true that the ancient and medieval worlds were far more connected than popular history often suggests. The Silk Road and its various branches carried not just goods but also ideas, techniques, and knowledge across vast distances. Mathematical knowledge, in particular, moved through scholarly networks that stretched from China to Spain during the medieval period. It is not impossible that geometric principles developed in one region spread to others through these networks. But the argument has limits. The kind of technical knowledge embedded in ceiling construction is not easily transmitted through casual contact. It requires sustained study and practice, and the evidence for the specific transmission of ceiling construction techniques across the distances in question is not clearly established in the historical record. That gap remains open. There is also a timing issue that the parallel development argument does not fully resolve. Some of the most sophisticated ceiling systems appear in different regions at roughly similar historical periods. If the development were truly independent, you might expect a more staggered timeline. One tradition developing advanced ceiling work significantly earlier than others, with the others catching up over time through their own internal development. But the timeline is less staggered than that model would predict. Advanced ceiling work appears in multiple traditions within overlapping historical windows. This doesn't prove connection, but it raises a question about whether the simultaneous appearance of similar technical achievements in different parts of the world is fully explained by independent development alone. The geographic distribution is also worth noting as a separate observation. These ceilings appear across an enormous range of territory. From the Atlantic coast of Europe to the western edge of the Indian subcontinent is a distance of several thousand miles. The ceiling traditions found across this range share certain features at a level of specificity that is unusual for independently developed systems. Mainstream historians acknowledge the similarities, but tend to address them through the frameworks of regional influence and trade contact, rather than anything more fundamental. Some believe that is sufficient. Others disagree and argue that the degree of specificity in the similarities requires a more direct explanation. That disagreement has not been settled. What adds another layer to this is the way these sealing traditions appear fully formed in their respective regions. There is often a point in the historical record where a particular sealing tradition simply appears, already at a high level of sophistication, without a clearly documented period of experimentation and development leading up to it. This has been noted in the Gothic vaulting tradition, in the early Islamic geometric tradition, and in certain South Asian temple traditions. Historians generally explain this through the argument that earlier, less sophisticated versions existed but have not survived, or that the developmental period occurred in a context that left fewer records. That explanation is possible, but it is also, in certain cases, speculative. The evidence for the developmental period is sometimes assumed rather than demonstrated. All of these observations together, the geographic spread, the proportional correspondences, the timing overlap, the fully formed early appearances, do not add up to a clear alternative explanation. They add up, instead, to a set of questions that the standard parallel development account does not fully answer. Each individual observation can be addressed separately with the reasonable response. But when the observations are considered together, the picture becomes more complex. The mainstream explanation covers the broad outlines convincingly. It accounts for the general similarities through universal geometry and independent development, but it does not fully account for the specific correspondences. And those specific correspondences are where the small doubts begin to accumulate. These doubts are not conclusions. It would be a mistake to treat them as such. They are observations. They point to areas where the current explanation leaves room for further investigation. The ceilings themselves are the evidence, measurable, physical, and still standing. And what they show, when measured carefully and compared across traditions, is a degree of similarity that the accepted explanation has not yet fully resolved. That is not a dramatic finding. It is a quiet one. But quiet findings in architectural history have a way of remaining unaddressed for a long time, not because they are unimportant, but because they are inconvenient to fit into frameworks that are already well established. And that, in itself, raises questions about how completely the current account of these ceilings has actually been examined. This is the point where the investigation becomes more specific. Up until now, the doubts have been general. They have involved broad observations about working conditions, cross-cultural similarities, and gaps in the explanatory framework. Those are real concerns, but they are the kind that can be addressed, at least partially, through reasonable argument. What comes next is different. What comes next involves specific, documented inconsistencies, observations recorded by researchers working within mainstream institutions, based on direct examination of the structures and the historical record. These are not speculative claims. They are findings, and they are findings that have not been fully addressed by the official account. It helps to understand first what an inconsistency in this context actually means. It does not mean proof of something extraordinary. It means a detail that does not fit cleanly into the accepted explanation. A piece of evidence that, when placed alongside what the historical record says, creates a gap. Small gaps can sometimes be explained away, but when gaps appear consistently, in different structures, in different regions, examined by different researchers at different times, they become harder to dismiss. They begin to suggest that something in the accepted account is either incomplete or imprecise. And that is exactly what has been observed in the study of these old ceilings. The first category of inconsistency involves timelines. Specifically, the timeline of technical development. In most areas of craft and construction, the development of skill follows a recognizable pattern. Early versions of a technique are rough. They are functional, but they show the limitations of a process that is still being worked out. Over time, through practice and accumulated experience, the technique improves. The results become more refined, more consistent, more sophisticated. This pattern is visible in many areas of ancient and medieval craftsmanship, early metalworking, early ceramic production, early textile design. The developmental arc is observable in the surviving record. You can see where the tradition started and how it grew. But in certain ceiling traditions, this arc is not clearly visible. Instead, something different appears. The earliest known examples of a particular sealing type are already highly refined. The precision is there from the beginning. The geometric consistency is present in the earliest surviving versions, and the expected period of rougher, developmental work that should logically precede this level of achievement is either absent from the record or represented only by examples that are not significantly less accomplished than later work. At first, this seems like it could be explained by missing evidence, earlier, cruder examples that simply have not survived. But this is where it becomes unclear. In many cases, the conditions that preserved the refined early examples would also have preserved less refined contemporary work, if such work existed. Its absence is not a guaranteed sign that it never existed, but it is a gap that requires explanation. This timeline inconsistency has been noted in specific architectural contexts. In certain early Islamic structures, for example, geometric sealing work appears at a level of sophistication that specialists associate with a mature tradition. Yet the historical timeline, as currently accepted, does not provide a sufficiently long developmental period before these early examples to account for that maturity. The tradition appears, in the record, almost fully formed. Historians have offered various explanations: that the knowledge was imported from earlier traditions, that earlier examples in perishable materials have not survived, that development occurred rapidly due to strong institutional support. These explanations are possible, but none of them has been demonstrated with the kind of direct evidence that would close the question completely. The timeline does not fully match what the developmental model predicts. A similar pattern appears in certain South Asian temple traditions. The earliest carved stone ceilings in some regional temple styles are among the most technically accomplished examples in the entire tradition. Later examples, built after the tradition had supposedly had more time to develop, are sometimes less refined in specific technical respects. This is the reverse of the expected developmental pattern. A tradition that starts highly refined and then shows variation in quality over time is unusual. It raises questions about whether the earliest examples represent the beginning of a tradition or whether they represent something else, possibly the continuation of a practice whose earlier phase has simply not been identified or is no longer accessible in the surviving record. The second category of inconsistency is more physical in nature. It involves the marks left on stone surfaces during the carving process. When stone is worked with hand tools, chisels, picks, abrasive stones, the tool leaves a mark on the surface. The pattern of that mark reflects how the tool was used: its depth, its regularity, the spacing between successive cuts, the angle at which it entered the stone. All of these features are readable to specialists who study ancient stoneworking. And what some of those specialists have found, when examining the carved stone ceilings in question, is that certain tool marks do not match the tools that were officially available and in use at the time the structures were built. This finding is not sensational in the way it might first appear. Tool mark analysis is a recognized field of study within archaeology and architectural history. It is technical, careful work. And when researchers in this field publish findings that note discrepancies between observed tool marks and the expected marks of period-appropriate tools, they are not making dramatic claims. They are recording observations. But those observations matter because tool marks are one of the most direct forms of physical evidence available for understanding ancient construction methods. If the marks don't match the tools, something in the current understanding of the construction process is incomplete. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. The specific discrepancy that has been noted in several cases involves the consistency and spacing of cut marks on carved stone ceiling surfaces. Manual stone cutting with hand chisels produces marks that vary slightly in depth and spacing as the craftsman's hand pressure and angle change during the work. That variation is normal and expected, but in certain sections of certain carved ceilings, the cut marks show a degree of regularity, in depth, in spacing, and in the angle of entry into the stone, that is more consistent than manual tool use typically produces. The marks look more like the output of a process that applied consistent force and consistent angle repeatedly across a large area. Whether that process was mechanical in some way, or whether it reflects a manual technique that has simply not been fully identified, is not currently known. But the marks themselves are there, and they have been measured and documented. It is important to be precise about what this means and what it does not mean. It does not mean that the ceilings were built with modern tools or by some non-human agency. It means that the tool marks in specific locations do not cleanly correspond to the marks expected from the tools listed in the official account of the construction period. That is a narrow but significant observation. It suggests either that the official account of available tools is incomplete, that there were tools or techniques in use that are not currently recognized, or that the carving method used to produce these specific marks has not been fully identified. Either possibility leaves a gap in the explanation, and that gap has been documented in published research that sits, largely unacknowledged, outside the mainstream discussion of these structures. The fact that these findings have been published in smaller academic papers and specialist building studies, rather than in mainstream architectural history, is itself worth noting. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. Research findings don't always move from specialist publications into mainstream awareness simply based on their content. The process of how findings become widely recognized is affected by many factors: the prestige of the publishing venue, the existing frameworks within which historians operate, the degree to which a finding challenges established consensus, and the availability of researchers willing to follow up on initial observations with further study. When findings consistently remain at the margins of mainstream discussion, despite being based on direct physical evidence, it raises questions about whether the mainstream account is as thoroughly examined as it appears. Some believe that the marginalization of these findings is simply a matter of academic prioritization. There are many aspects of ancient and medieval architecture to study, and not every specialist observation can receive equal attention. Others disagree and suggest that findings which create inconvenient gaps in well-established explanations tend to receive less attention than findings that confirm existing frameworks. That dynamic, if it exists, would not be unique to architectural history. It appears in many academic fields, but its presence would mean that the official account of these ceilings is shaped not only by what the evidence shows, but also by which parts of the evidence have been most thoroughly examined and most widely discussed. There is also the question of how these inconsistencies interact with each other. The timeline inconsistency and the tool mark inconsistency are separate observations. They arise from different types of analysis: historical record study on one side, physical material analysis on the other. But they point in the same direction. Both suggest that the current account of how these ceilings were built is missing something. Both suggest that the full picture of the construction process has not been established, and the fact that two different types of investigation produce observations that complement each other in this way is more significant than either observation alone. It suggests the gaps are not random. They cluster around a specific part of the construction process, the part that involves the finest precision and the most technically demanding work. What makes this particularly difficult to dismiss is that the researchers involved in documenting these inconsistencies are not working outside the mainstream. Some of them are affiliated with universities and research institutions. Some of them have published in peer-reviewed contexts. They are not making unsupported claims. They are making careful, specific observations and noting that those observations do not fit cleanly into the accepted explanation. The response from the wider academic community has generally been limited. The observations have not been refuted with counter-evidence. They have, for the most part, simply not been engaged with at the level of depth that the evidence would seem to warrant. This pattern, specific documented inconsistencies, published but not widely discussed, fitting into a broader set of questions that the mainstream account has not fully resolved, is exactly what makes this topic worth continued investigation. The inconsistencies are not proof of anything beyond themselves. They are gaps. They are places where the explanation, as currently presented, does not fully account for the physical evidence, and they are consistent enough and specific enough to suggest that the full picture of how these old ceilings were built remains, at this point, genuinely incomplete. Not dramatically, not sensationally, just quietly, specifically, and persistently incomplete. And that is a harder kind of uncertainty to resolve than a straightforward disagreement, because it requires not just a different answer, but a more careful examination of the evidence that is already there. Some researchers have moved beyond the surface of these ceilings. They have stopped looking only at the decoration, the patterns, and the tool marks, and have started looking at something deeper, They have begun examining the structural logic built into these ceilings, the engineering principles that determine how the ceiling holds itself up, how it transfers weight, and how it remains stable over centuries. And when that layer of the investigation is opened, the questions that emerge are harder to set aside than the ones that came before. To understand why this matters, it helps to think briefly about what structural engineering actually involves. When a ceiling is built over a large open space, it faces a fundamental physical challenge. Its own weight must be supported. The forces created by that weight must travel downward through the structure and into the walls and foundations below. If those forces are not managed correctly, the ceiling fails. It cracks, deforms, or collapses. Managing those forces is not a simple task. The shape of the ceiling, the thickness of its sections, the placement of its supporting elements, all of these factors interact with each other in ways that are mathematically complex. Getting them right requires either a deep understanding of the underlying principles or a very long and costly process of learning through failure. Modern structural engineering addresses this challenge through calculation. Engineers use mathematical methods to model how forces move through a structure before it is built. They can predict, with considerable accuracy, where stress will concentrate, where a design is vulnerable, and what adjustments are needed to produce a stable result. These methods developed gradually over several centuries, with significant advances occurring in the 18th and 19th centuries as mathematics and physical science became more formalized and more powerful. Before those advances, the engineering principles behind large ceiling structures were not formally understood in the way they are today. That is the accepted historical position, and at a general level, it is well supported. But this is where it becomes unclear. When modern structural engineers analyze certain very old vaulted and domed ceilings, applying current mathematical methods to measure how effectively the structure manages its load, they find something unexpected. The load distribution in some of these ancient ceilings is geometrically optimized. This means the shape of the ceiling, as actually built, distributes the structural forces in a way that minimizes stress concentrations and maximizes stability. The ceiling is not just functional, it is efficient, and the degree of efficiency observed in certain structures is not what you would expect from a process of intuitive development or gradual trial and error. It is closer to what you would expect from a process of deliberate, mathematically informed design. It is worth being precise about what geometrically optimized means in this context, because the term can sound more technical than it needs to. When engineers say a structure is optimized for load distribution, they mean that the shape of the structure closely matches the ideal shape for carrying its particular load with minimal material stress. For a ceiling or vault, the ideal shape is determined by the specific mathematical relationship between the geometry of the curve and the forces acting on it. A structure that closely matches this ideal shape will be more stable, more durable, and more efficient in its use of material than one that approximates it loosely. Finding that ideal shape through calculation requires specific mathematical tools. Finding it through trial and error is theoretically possible, but practically very difficult because the relationship between shape and load distribution is not intuitively obvious. Small changes in shape produce significant changes in structural behavior, and those changes are not easily readable without formal analysis. The standard historical explanation for how ancient builders achieved structurally sound ceilings is the trial and error argument. Over many generations, builders experimented with different shapes and proportions. Structures that failed were rebuilt differently. Structures that succeeded were copied and refined. Over time, through this process of accumulated experience, effective forms were identified and passed down as established practice. This explanation is not unreasonable. It is, in fact, the explanation that applies to many areas of ancient and medieval technology, and some version of it almost certainly played a role in the development of these ceiling traditions. But there's a problem with applying it uniformly to every case. Trial and error, as a learning process, leaves a specific kind of evidence in the historical record. It leaves evidence of failure, collapsed structures, rebuilt sections, records of construction projects that did not succeed. It also leaves a developmental gradient, early attempts that are structurally functional but not highly optimized, followed by progressively better results as the effective forms are identified through experience. This gradient should be visible in the surviving record of structures built across the developmental period. And in some ceiling traditions, it is visible. You can see the development happening. The early structures are sound but not exceptional. The later ones are more refined. That is exactly what the trial and error model predicts, and it is a convincing confirmation of the explanation in those cases. But in other cases, the gradient is not visible in the way the model predicts. Some of the oldest surviving examples of certain ceiling types display a level of structural optimization that later examples in the same tradition do not consistently exceed. The earliest known versions are already among the most efficiently designed. The evidence of a learning curve leading up to that level of optimization is either absent or unclear, and the evidence of failed attempts, collapsed structures, significantly rebuilt sections, records of early construction problems in the same tradition, is not present in the quantities that a genuine trial and error developmental period would typically produce. This does not fully match how trial and error learning usually works, and that gap has been noted by researchers who study structural engineering history specifically. There is an additional observation that deepens this question. In modern structural analysis, when engineers study these ancient optimized ceilings, they sometimes find that the degree of optimization present in the structure could not have been easily discovered through simple trial and error even over a very long period. The reason is that the relationship between the specific geometric form used and the structural efficiency it produces is not a relationship that becomes apparent from observing a structure's behavior under normal conditions. A ceiling that is nearly optimized and a ceiling that is fully optimized may look identical and behave identically under ordinary loads. The difference between them only becomes apparent under specific stress conditions, conditions that may not have occurred frequently enough during a developmental period to provide the feedback needed to refine the design toward full optimization. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. If the builders could not have easily discovered the optimal form through observing the behavior of their structures under normal conditions, then how did they arrive at forms that are, by modern measurement, very close to the mathematical optimum? Some believe the answer is that the forms were discovered through a much longer developmental period than the surviving record shows, that many generations of experimentation occurred before the earliest surviving examples were built, and that all the evidence of that developmental period has simply not survived. That is possible. The survival of ancient structures is uneven, and the absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. But others disagree and point out that this explanation requires assuming a developmental period for which there is no direct evidence, in order to protect an explanatory framework that the available physical evidence is already straining. The question of how deliberately these structures were designed is also relevant here. Modern analysis of certain ancient ceiling geometries has found that the specific proportional systems used, the ratios that determine the curvature, the thickness, and the span of the ceiling, correspond to mathematical relationships that produce structural efficiency. These are not arbitrary proportions. They are specific values that, when applied to ceiling design, produce geometrically optimized results. The question of whether ancient builders knew why these proportions worked, or simply knew that they worked, is one that historians have not fully resolved. Some believe the builders understood the underlying principles at a level that has not been documented in surviving texts. Others disagree and prefer the intuitive knowledge argument, that the proportions were used because they were known to work, without the builders necessarily understanding the mathematical reason why. That distinction matters more than it might initially appear. If the builders were simply using proportions known through practice to be effective, the trial and error explanation remains viable, even if its details are unclear. But if the proportions were selected on the basis of some form of structural understanding, even an informal one, then the knowledge base of these builders was more sophisticated than the official account typically suggests. And there is indirect evidence, in several architectural traditions, that the selection of proportions was not purely empirical. Certain surviving design documents and geometric diagrams from medieval Islamic and European architectural traditions show proportional systems that appear to encode structural principles, not just aesthetic preferences. The implications of those documents have not been fully explored in mainstream architectural history. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. What makes this layer of the investigation particularly significant is that it connects the decorative and the structural in a way that has not been fully acknowledged. The precision of the geometric patterns on these ceilings is not separate from the structural efficiency of the ceiling forms. In many cases, the decorative geometry and the structural geometry are the same geometry. The pattern that creates the visual effect is also the pattern that distributes the load. This integration of the decorative and the structural is not a coincidence. It reflects a design approach in which the geometry serves multiple purposes simultaneously. Understanding how that integrated approach was developed, and whether it was developed through intuition, through formal knowledge, or through some combination of the two, is a question that has not been answered clearly. The evidence that has accumulated through structural analysis of these ceilings does not overturn the standard explanation. The ceilings were built by human builders using available materials and techniques. That remains the foundation of the accepted account, and nothing in the structural analysis directly contradicts it. But the structural analysis does add a layer of complexity that the standard account has not fully absorbed. It shows that certain ancient ceilings are not just impressive in appearance. They are impressive in their engineering. And the precision of that engineering, the closeness with which the actual built forms approach mathematical optimality, raises questions about the knowledge that guided their design. Those questions remain open. The structural evidence is documented. The gap between the level of optimization observed and the level that trial and error development would reliably produce has been noted. The proportional systems that appear to encode structural principles have been identified, but the explanation for how all of this came together in structures built centuries before the formal mathematics of structural engineering was developed has not been clearly established. It has been assumed, generalized, or set aside. And in investigation, what has been set aside is often exactly where the most important questions are waiting. There is a point in any careful investigation where individual observations stop being just individual observations. They start forming something larger. They start connecting. And when that happens, when separate findings from separate sources begin pointing in the same direction, the investigation enters a different phase. It is no longer about any single detail. It is about what the details, taken together, are actually showing. That point has now been reached in this examination of old ceilings, and what the accumulated observations show, when viewed as a whole rather than in isolation, is a pattern. A consistent, repeating pattern that appears across different buildings, different cultures, and different centuries. And in investigation, a repeating pattern is always significant. The first element of this pattern has been discussed at length. It is the precision. Across multiple ceiling traditions, in multiple regions, the finished work consistently displays a level of geometric accuracy and surface regularity that exceeds what the documented working conditions and available tools would reliably support. This observation has come from conservation specialists, from craftsmen attempting replication, and from researchers studying the physical surfaces of the structures directly. It is not a theoretical concern. It is a measurable one. The precision is there. It can be quantified, and when it is quantified and compared against the conditions under which the work was produced, a gap appears. That gap has not been closed by the current explanation. It has been acknowledged in parts, addressed partially, and then generally left without full resolution. The second element of the pattern is the timeline issue. In several distinct ceiling traditions, the earliest known examples of a particular ceiling type are already highly accomplished. The developmental period, the phase of rougher, experimental work that should logically precede a mature and refined tradition, is either absent from the record or represented only weakly. This has been noted in early Islamic geometric ceiling work, in certain South Asian temple traditions, and in early examples of European vaulted ceiling systems. In each case, the explanation offered is broadly similar. Earlier, less refined examples must have existed but have not survived. Development occurred in a period or context that left fewer traces. These explanations are possible, but they are also, in each case, unverified. They are inferences drawn to fill a gap, not conclusions supported by direct evidence. And when the same inferred explanation is needed repeatedly, in different traditions, to fill the same type of gap, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. The third element involves structural engineering. The load distribution characteristics of certain ancient ceiling forms have been found, through modern analysis, to closely approach mathematical optimality. This means the shapes used were not just functional. They were efficient in a way that formal engineering mathematics, developed much later, can recognize and measure. The standard explanation, intuitive knowledge developed through trial and error, has been applied here as well. And again, it is possible. But as discussed earlier, full structural optimization through trial and error is difficult to achieve, because the feedback from observing a structure under normal conditions does not clearly distinguish between a nearly optimal form and a fully optimal one. The precision of the optimization observed in certain structures is, in specific cases, higher than trial and error would be expected to reliably produce. And the evidence of the failed attempts that trial and error generates, collapsed sections, rebuilt vaults, records of significant construction problems, is not always present in the quantities the model requires. The fourth element is the cross-cultural similarity. Specific proportional relationships and geometric systems, found in these ceiling traditions, appear in multiple unconnected cultures with a degree of correspondence that parallel development does not cleanly explain. General similarity can be explained by universal geometry and shared structural logic, but specific proportional correspondences, embedded in the mathematical framework of the designs rather than just their visual appearance, require something more, either direct or indirect contact between traditions, through channels not well documented, or a common source of geometric knowledge that predates the individual traditions in which it appears. Neither of these possibilities has been demonstrated, but neither has been ruled out. The correspondence is documented. Its explanation is not. These four elements, precision beyond conditions, absence of developmental evidence, structural optimization without formal mathematics, and cross-cultural correspondence without clear transmission, are the main recurring features of this pattern. And it is the recurrence that matters here. Each element appears not once, in one structure, in one tradition. Each appears repeatedly, in different buildings, in different countries, examined by different researchers using different methods. The pattern is consistent, and a consistent pattern in investigation carries more weight than any individual observation within it. It suggests that something systematic is at work, something that applies broadly rather than occasionally, and that systematic quality is what makes the pattern difficult to dismiss through case-by-case explanation. The mainstream response to these observations has generally followed a specific approach. Each issue is addressed separately. The precision question is answered with references to craftsman skill and organized labor. The timeline question is answered with references to missing evidence and unpreserved early examples. The structural optimization question is answered with references to intuitive knowledge and trial and error. The cross-cultural similarity question is answered with references to trade routes and parallel development. Each response is applied to its corresponding observation, and the observation is considered addressed. But this is where it becomes unclear. The approach of addressing each point individually works only if the points are genuinely independent of each other. If they are connected, if they are all symptoms of the same underlying gap in the current understanding, then addressing them separately does not resolve the underlying issue. It simply manages the appearance of the problem without engaging with its source. Consider what it would mean for all four elements to have separate, unrelated explanations. It would mean that the precision gap is explained by one factor, the timeline gap by another, the structural optimization gap by a third, and the cross-cultural similarity gap by a fourth. Each factor is distinct. Each applies only to its specific observation. The four gaps just happen to appear together, consistently, across the same set of structures, examined by the same types of researchers. That is possible. Coincidences exist in research as in everything else. But the more consistently a coincidence appears, across more cases, examined by more independent observers, the less comfortable it becomes to continue treating it as a coincidence. At some point, the pattern itself becomes evidence of something that the individual explanations are not capturing. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. Some believe that the convergence of these observations reflects nothing more than the general incompleteness of the historical record. Ancient and medieval construction history is not a fully documented field. Large amounts of information have been lost. Records were destroyed, decayed, or never written down in the first place. The gaps in the explanatory framework, on this view, are simply gaps in the surviving evidence. Gaps that will likely be filled as more research is conducted and more structures are studied in detail. This is a reasonable position, and it deserves to be taken seriously. Absence of evidence is genuinely not the same as evidence of absence. The missing developmental records, the unpreserved early examples, the undocumented transmission of knowledge, all of these things could theoretically exist without having survived into the present. Others disagree with this position, and their disagreement is also reasonable. They point out that the historical record, incomplete as it is, has been studied extensively for a long time. The major architectural traditions in question have been the subject of serious academic research for well over a century. If the missing evidence, the early rough examples, the failed attempts, the records of knowledge transmission, existed in recoverable form, some of it should have surfaced by now. The persistent absence of this evidence, across well-studied traditions, across multiple regions, despite sustained scholarly attention, begins to look less like a gap in the record and more like a genuine absence of something that may never have existed in the first place. That is a more uncomfortable conclusion, but it is one that the pattern of observations, considered honestly, does not allow to be entirely set aside. The question this raises is not a simple one. If the standard explanations, skill, time, intuition, parallel development, are incomplete, what are they incomplete in the direction of? What is the missing element that would account for the precision, the absent developmental trail, the structural optimization, and the cross-cultural correspondence simultaneously? That is the question the pattern is pointing toward, and it is a question that the current state of research has not answered. Various possibilities have been proposed, and some of them will be examined as this investigation continues. But at this stage, the important thing is to recognize that the question exists, that the pattern of observations requires an explanation that addresses it as a whole, not just as a collection of separate details. There is also a broader observation worth making about how this pattern has been received in the research community. The individual observations within the pattern have not, for the most part, been disputed. The precision measurements are accepted. The timeline gaps are acknowledged. The structural optimization findings are recognized. The cross-cultural correspondences are noted. What has not been widely accepted is the significance of these observations in combination. The pattern, as a pattern, has not been formally addressed. This is a significant gap not in the structures themselves, but in the research about them. A set of consistent, recurring observations pointing in the same direction has not produced a systematic investigation into what they might be pointing toward. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. In investigation, the absence of a systematic response to a systematic pattern is itself informative. It suggests either that the pattern has not been clearly recognized as such, or that recognizing it as such would require engaging with implications that existing frameworks are not well positioned to accommodate. Either possibility is worth considering. The pattern is there. It has been built up gradually through observations from multiple sources, multiple methods, and multiple traditions. It is consistent. It is specific, and it points toward a part of the accepted account of these old ceilings that has not been fully examined, not toward a dramatic alternative explanation, simply toward an area of genuine uncertainty that the standard account has, so far, not fully resolved. And that uncertainty, quiet and specific as it is, does not fully make sense to continue setting aside. Up to this point, the investigation has focused primarily on the ceilings themselves, the precision of their construction, the gaps in their developmental timeline, the structural optimization embedded in their forms, the cross-cultural correspondences that parallel development does not fully explain. These are all observations drawn from studying the ceilings as isolated objects, surfaces to be measured, analyzed, and compared against the historical record. But there's a problem with that approach. It treats the ceiling as if it exists independently of everything around it, and in almost every case being examined here, it does not. These ceilings are part of larger structures. They are connected, physically and functionally, to the walls beneath them, the columns supporting those walls, the arches transferring load between elements, and the foundations carrying everything down to the ground. And when you begin looking at the ceiling not as an isolated surface, But as one component of a larger integrated system, the questions expand considerably. The idea of an integrated structural system is not complicated. In any well-designed building, the different parts work together. The ceiling transfers its load to the walls. The walls transfer load to the foundations. The arches manage the lateral forces that vaulted ceilings generate. Each element is designed with an awareness of what the other elements are doing, because changing one part of the system affects how all the other parts behave. This kind of integrated thinking is standard in modern architecture and engineering. What is less clear is the degree to which it was present in ancient and medieval building traditions, and the degree to which the specific coordination visible in some of these old structures reflects a level of integrated planning that goes beyond what the official account typically attributes to builders of those periods. In several large temple complexes in India, researchers studying the relationship between the ceiling and the broader structure have found something that extends the investigation into a new area entirely. The ceiling carvings in certain temples are not positioned randomly. Their placement corresponds to astronomical orientations. Specific decorative elements are located at positions where they interact with natural light in precise ways at particular times of year. At certain seasons, sunlight entering the structure through specific openings falls on specific ceiling features at specific times of day. This is not accidental. The consistency of the pattern across multiple structures and the precision of the alignment between the decorative elements and the astronomical events rules out coincidence in the cases that have been most carefully studied. The builders were working with more than architectural knowledge. They were integrating astronomical awareness into the physical design of the structure at a level of precision that required both detailed observational knowledge of celestial movements and the technical ability to translate that knowledge into precise spatial positioning within a building. This raises questions that go significantly beyond ceiling construction. Accurately predicting the position of sunlight inside a building at a specific time of year requires knowing the angle of the sun at that time and location, the orientation of the building relative to cardinal directions, the size and position of the light openings, and the precise position of the interior feature that the light is intended to reach. Getting all of these factors right, consistently, across multiple structures built in different locations and different periods, requires a systematic and accurate body of astronomical and geometric knowledge. The Shilpa Shastras, the ancient Indian architectural texts, do describe cosmological and directional principles that should guide temple construction. But the level of precision visible in the astronomical alignments of certain structures goes beyond what those texts, as they survive today, explicitly describe. Something in the knowledge base of these builders is not fully captured in the surviving textual record, and that is where it becomes unclear. The integration of astronomy into ceiling design is not unique to India. Similar patterns of astronomical alignment have been identified in certain medieval Islamic structures, where geometric ceiling patterns are oriented in ways that relate to astronomical and calendrical knowledge. In some mosques, the geometric systems of the ceiling and the direction of prayer orientation are integrated in a way that reflects a detailed understanding of geographical and astronomical relationships. The precision of this integration, in specific well-studied examples, is again higher than casual or approximate astronomical knowledge would produce. It reflects careful calculation, but the record of how that calculation was carried out, who performed it, what methods were used, and how the results were translated into construction plans, is not clearly preserved, and this is where the explanation becomes difficult. In Persian and Ottoman palace architecture, a different but related phenomenon has been documented. The geometric designs found on ceilings in these traditions have been analyzed mathematically, and the analysis has revealed that certain designs encode specific mathematical ratios. These ratios are not simple ones. They correspond to relationships found in advanced geometric theory, relationships between quantities that, in the formal history of mathematics, were not systematically described until relatively late in the historical record. The designs contain these ratios not as occasional features, but as structuring principles. The entire geometric system of certain ceiling designs is built around proportional relationships that reflect a sophisticated mathematical understanding. Whether that understanding was conscious and deliberate, or whether it emerged intuitively through the practice of geometric design without the builders necessarily recognizing the mathematical relationships they were producing, is a question that has not been resolved. Some researchers believe the mathematical ratios encoded in these designs were placed there deliberately. On this view, the ceiling designs were not purely decorative. They were a form of knowledge encoding, a way of preserving and communicating mathematical relationships through geometric form in a context where that form would be protected by its association with sacred or prestigious buildings. This is not an implausible idea. There are documented examples from other cultural traditions of mathematical and astronomical knowledge being encoded in architectural and artistic forms as a preservation strategy. The question is whether the evidence in these specific cases is strong enough to support that interpretation, and whether the alternative, that the ratios appeared coincidentally or intuitively, is less consistent with the available evidence. Some believe the encoding interpretation is well supported. Others disagree. The debate has not produced a consensus. What is clear, regardless of how the encoding question is resolved, is that the mathematical ratios are present in the designs. They have been measured and documented, and their presence, whatever its origin, means that the ceiling designs reflect a level of mathematical sophistication that the official account of the builder's knowledge does not always explicitly acknowledge. The standard description of these traditions tends to emphasize artistic and religious motivations for the geometric work. The mathematical depth embedded in the designs is sometimes noted in specialist literature, but it is rarely foregrounded in general historical accounts. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because the mathematical content of these designs is not incidental. It is structural. It shapes the designs from the ground up, and acknowledging it fully changes the picture of what the builders knew and how they worked. The scope of the problem, when viewed this way, has expanded significantly from where the investigation began. It started with a question about how ceilings were constructed, about tools and conditions and precision. That question remains open, but it has been joined by a larger set of questions about the knowledge base that guided the construction. The builders of these ceilings were not only skilled craftsmen, they were, in at least some cases, working with integrated knowledge that spanned architecture, geometry, mathematics, and astronomy. They were applying that knowledge in a coordinated way, designing ceilings that were not only structurally efficient and visually precise, but also astronomically oriented and mathematically encoded. That is a picture of intellectual capability that is considerably more complex than the standard account typically presents, and it raises a question that the standard account has not fully addressed. Where did that integrated knowledge come from, and how was it organized and transmitted? This question is not easily answered by the existing explanatory frameworks. The guild system, the architectural manuals, the Shilpa Shastras, these are all transmission mechanisms for specific types of knowledge within specific traditions. They explain how construction technique was passed from one generation to the next within a single tradition. They do not easily explain how integrated knowledge spanning multiple disciplines was developed, maintained, and applied with a consistency visible across these structures. Nor do they explain the cross-cultural correspondences in the mathematical content of the designs. If each tradition developed its geometric and mathematical knowledge independently, the specific proportional correspondences across traditions require a separate explanation, and that explanation has not been provided clearly. But this is where the explanation becomes difficult. There's also the question of what happens when all these layers are considered together. A ceiling that is precisely constructed under difficult conditions. A tradition that appears highly developed without a clear developmental trail. A structure optimized to a degree that formal mathematics would struggle to improve upon. A design that encodes advanced mathematical ratios. A layout that integrates astronomical knowledge with architectural positioning. All of these features, appearing in the same building or the same tradition, are not independent observations. They are aspects of a single, integrated design achievement, and treating them as separate observations, each to be explained by its own individual factor, misses the integration. It misses the fact that all of these features together require a knowledge base that was not simply broad, but deeply coordinated, and that coordinated depth is not something that the current account of these builders fully describes. Some believe that this coordinated depth reflects the full capabilities of ancient and medieval civilizations, capabilities that modern history has consistently underestimated. On this view, the integrated knowledge visible in these structures is real evidence of intellectual achievement that deserves more direct acknowledgement than it has generally received. Others disagree and prefer explanations that reduce the apparent sophistication to more familiar factors: practice, intuition, accumulated tradition. The disagreement is genuine, and it has not been resolved. But the evidence that generates it is physical. It exists in the structures. It can be measured. It does not disappear when the discussion ends. What the expansion of the problem into astronomy, mathematics, and integrated planning ultimately shows is that the original question, how were these ceilings made, was always smaller than the full question these structures raise. The ceilings are not just construction achievements. They are the visible surface of a knowledge tradition whose full depth has not been mapped. And until it is mapped more carefully, until the astronomical alignments, the mathematical encodings, the structural optimizations, and the cross-cultural correspondences are examined together rather than separately, the picture of who built these ceilings, and what they actually knew, will remain incomplete, not in a minor way, in a way that matters to how we understand the intellectual history of the ancient and medieval world. And that is a significantly larger question than the one this investigation began with. When an investigation reaches the point where the standard explanation has been found incomplete, and the gaps in that explanation have been documented carefully, the next natural step is to look at what alternative interpretations exist, not to accept any of them uncritically, not to replace one incomplete explanation with another, but to understand what different researchers have proposed, why they have proposed it, and how well each proposal actually accounts for the evidence that the standard explanation has struggled with. That is a necessary part of any serious investigation, and in the study of these old ceilings, several distinct alternative interpretations have been developed by researchers working from different starting points and different areas of expertise. None of these interpretations has been proven. None has achieved mainstream acceptance, but each one addresses something real in the evidence, and each one is worth examining carefully on its own terms. Before looking at the individual interpretations, it helps to understand the context in which they have developed. Alternative views in historical research do not typically emerge from nowhere. They emerge in response to specific problems, specific places where the accepted account fails to provide a satisfying explanation for documented evidence. The alternative interpretations surrounding these ceilings have developed precisely in the areas where the standard explanation is weakest: the precision without a clear technical basis, the absent developmental trail, the structural optimization that predates formal engineering, the mathematical content that exceeds what the official account of the builder's knowledge describes. Each alternative interpretation is, in part, an attempt to account for one or more of these specific problems. Understanding that context makes it easier to evaluate each interpretation fairly, without either dismissing it reflexively or accepting it without scrutiny. The first alternative interpretation is perhaps the most structured of the three main views. It centers on the idea that the builders of these ceilings had access to advanced technical knowledge that was deliberately restricted, kept within specific institutions or social groups, and not written down openly or shared with the general public. The institutions most commonly cited in this view include priestly orders associated with temple complexes, specialized craft guilds whose internal knowledge was protected by tradition and sometimes by formal obligation, and what some researchers describe as schools of architecture that operated within religious or royal institutions and maintained knowledge traditions that were not made publicly available. The argument is that this restricted knowledge was more sophisticated than the surviving public record shows, and that the ceilings are physical evidence of what that knowledge was capable of producing. This interpretation has some historical basis. The restriction of specialized knowledge was not unusual in ancient and medieval societies. Craft guilds in medieval Europe did protect their techniques from outside access. Temple traditions in India maintained restricted bodies of ritual and technical knowledge that were transmitted only within specific lineages. Mathematical and astronomical knowledge in various ancient cultures was held by specialists whose methods were not openly published. So the idea that advanced technical knowledge could exist without appearing clearly in the general historical record is not inherently implausible. The question is whether the specific knowledge required to produce these sealings was of the restricted type, and whether the absence of that knowledge from the surviving record reflects deliberate restriction rather than simply incomplete survival of documents. That is a difficult question to answer, because proving that something was deliberately withheld is harder than proving that it existed, and this is where it becomes unclear. There is also a specific problem with this interpretation as a complete explanation. If the knowledge was transmitted through restricted channels, orally, within specific institutions, without written documentation, then it was vulnerable to interruption. If the institution that held the knowledge was disrupted, disbanded, or destroyed, the knowledge could be lost. And there are historical examples of exactly this kind of loss. Traditions that were discontinued, institutions that were dissolved, lineages that were broken by conquest, forced conversion, or social change. The restricted knowledge interpretation, taken seriously, implies that some of what these builders knew may no longer exist in any recoverable form. That is a significant implication. It means that the full explanation for how these sealings were made might not be available even in principle, given the current state of the historical record. Some believe that conclusion is uncomfortable enough to argue against the interpretation. Others disagree and point out that uncomfortable conclusions are not false simply because they are uncomfortable. The second alternative interpretation takes a different approach. Rather than focusing on how knowledge was transmitted, it focuses on what knowledge existed. This view holds that certain mathematical and geometric principles were understood in the ancient world significantly earlier than mainstream history currently accepts. The ceilings on this interpretation are not mysterious because of how the knowledge was kept or transmitted. They are meaningful because of what knowledge they reflect, a level of mathematical and geometric understanding that the standard historical timeline places much later than the evidence in the structures themselves seems to support. The argument is not that ancient civilizations had modern science. It is specifically that their mathematical knowledge, particularly in geometry and its application to spatial design, was more advanced at an earlier date than has been formally recognized. This interpretation draws some support from historical discoveries that have genuinely revised the accepted timeline of mathematical knowledge. There are documented cases where ancient texts or artifacts, when analyzed carefully, have revealed mathematical understanding that was previously thought to be much later in origin. The discovery that certain Babylonian mathematical tablets contained methods equivalent to what was later formalized in Greek and European mathematics is one well-known example. These discoveries have not overturned the general historical framework, but they have repeatedly shown that the timeline of mathematical development is less straightforward than this simple linear progression suggests. Knowledge was sometimes more advanced, earlier, than the standard account predicted. The question relevant to the ceilings is whether a similar revision is needed for the specific geometric and structural knowledge embedded in these structures. Some believe it is. Others disagree and argue that the existing evidence for early mathematical sophistication does not reach the level required to explain what is observed in the ceiling designs. That disagreement has not been resolved. There is also a limitation specific to this interpretation. Even if certain mathematical principles were understood earlier than currently accepted, that does not by itself explain the precision of the physical construction. Understanding a mathematical principle and translating it into consistent physical results under difficult working conditions are two separate challenges. The second interpretation addresses the knowledge side of the problem more directly than the practical execution side. A builder could understand the geometry of an optimized vault without having a reliable method for constructing it to the required degree of precision under field conditions. The knowledge gap and the execution gap are related, but they are not the same gap, and addressing only one of them leaves the other open. This is where the explanation becomes difficult for this view as well. The third interpretation is the most conventional of the three, in the sense that it operates most closely within the existing historical framework. It proposes that cultural exchange between different regions and traditions was more extensive than the current historical record documents. On this view, the cross-cultural similarities in ceiling precision, geometric systems, and mathematical content are not the result of independent parallel development or of a common ancient origin. They are the result of contact, of knowledge moving between traditions through trade routes, scholarly networks, traveling craftsmen, or migration. The argument is that the channels through which this knowledge moved simply have not been fully traced, and that more thorough investigation of the historical record of contact between the relevant regions would reveal the transmission pathways that explain the similarities. This interpretation is the easiest to defend within conventional historical methodology because it requires no assumptions about hidden knowledge traditions or revised mathematical timelines. It simply requires that contact between cultures was more frequent and more technically significant than is currently well documented. And there is genuine historical support for the idea that the ancient and medieval worlds were more connected than popular history often suggests. Long-distance trade networks carried goods and people across enormous distances. Scholarly exchange between different intellectual traditions, Islamic, Indian, European, Central Asian, is well documented in the medieval period. The movement of craftsmen between royal courts and major building projects is recorded in various historical sources. So the general mechanism proposed by this interpretation is historically real, but the interpretation faces a specific challenge when applied to the sealing evidence. Some believe the cross-cultural correspondences are well within the range of what documented contact could explain. Others disagree and point out that certain specific proportional and mathematical correspondences across traditions go beyond what incidental or general cultural contact would reliably produce. Transmitting the ability to produce highly optimized sealing structures with sophisticated embedded geometry requires more than a traveler describing what a building looks like. It requires the transmission of a technical practice, methods, measurements, proportional systems, construction sequences. That kind of knowledge transfer requires sustained, deliberate, organized contact of a type that is not well documented for many of the traditions in question. And the timeline of certain correspondences does not always align well with the periods of most intensive documented contact. However, the timeline does not fully match in ways that this interpretation has not yet resolved. What is particularly significant is that each of these three interpretations addresses a different part of the overall problem. The restricted knowledge interpretation addresses the absence of technical detail in the surviving record. The early mathematical knowledge interpretation addresses the gap between the sophistication of the designs and the accepted history of mathematical development. The extensive cultural exchange interpretation addresses the cross-cultural correspondences in the sealing traditions. Each interpretation is, to some degree, internally coherent. Each has at least some supporting evidence, and each fails, in some specific way, to account for all of the observations that the investigation has accumulated. That pattern, three interpretations, each partial, none complete, is itself informative. It suggests that the full explanation, whatever it turns out to be, is more complex than any single current proposal has managed to capture. Some believe that the answer lies in a combination of these views, that restricted knowledge, early mathematical sophistication, and extensive cultural exchange all played a role, and that their combined effect is what produced the results visible in these structures. That is a reasonable position, but a combined explanation is only as strong as the evidence supporting each of its components. And as noted, each component is currently supported by evidence that is suggestive rather than conclusive. The combination does not resolve the individual weaknesses. It simply distributes them across a larger framework, and that framework, while broader, remains unproven in its specific claims. None of these interpretations has been confirmed. That statement bears repeating, because it is the most important single observation about the current state of the alternative views. The evidence that has driven researchers toward these alternatives is real. The gaps in the standard explanation are real, but the alternatives themselves remain proposals rather than conclusions. They represent the current state of thinking about a problem that has not yet been solved, and the fact that three distinct, partially supported, mutually incomplete interpretations coexist without any of them achieving resolution is the clearest possible signal that the investigation is not finished. The question of what these builders knew, and how they knew it, remains genuinely open, and an open question, approached honestly, is always more valuable than a closed one that was never fully examined. After everything that has been examined, the construction methods, the precision of the finished work, the structural engineering embedded in the forms, the timeline inconsistencies, the cross-cultural patterns, the astronomical alignments, the mathematical content of the designs, and the alternative interpretations that researchers have proposed. The most honest thing that can be said is this: the investigation has not produced a clean answer. It has produced a clearer picture of the question. And sometimes, that is what a careful investigation produces. Not resolution, clarity about what remains unresolved. And in this case, what remains unresolved is specific enough, and consistent enough, and well-documented enough, that it deserves to be stated plainly rather than softened into a comfortable conclusion that the evidence does not actually support. The starting point for this honest assessment has to be an acknowledgement of what the official explanation does correctly explain. It is important to be precise about this, because the investigation has not been an argument against the standard account. It has been an examination of where that account is complete and where it is not. And in many important respects, it is complete. The broad framework is sound. Skilled human craftsmen built these structures. That is not in question. The labor was organized, sustained, and carried out by people who understood their materials and their craft at a deep level. The geometric and mathematical knowledge embedded in these traditions was real knowledge, developed by real thinkers, and passed down through real institutions. The guild system, the architectural schools, the ancient texts, these were genuine transmission mechanisms for genuine knowledge. None of that is being disputed here, and it would be intellectually dishonest to proceed as if the official explanation has no solid ground to stand on. It does. It is just not standing on all of the ground that the evidence covers. The precision question has not been resolved. This is the observation that started the investigation, and it remains the one that sits most visibly in the gap between the official account and the physical evidence. These ceilings, measured carefully by conservation specialists and structural analysts, display a level of geometric regularity and surface consistency that exceeds what the documented working conditions reliably support. That finding has come from multiple independent sources. It has not been contested with countermeasurements. It has been acknowledged in specialist literature and then, for the most part, left without a satisfying explanation. The standard response, skilled craftsmen, long experience, organized labor, describes the inputs to the process. It does not explain how those inputs produced outputs of this specific quality under these specific conditions. And that gap between input description and output quality is still open. The developmental trail question is also still open. In several ceiling traditions, the earliest surviving examples are among the most accomplished. The expected progression from rough early work to refined later work is not clearly visible in the record. Historians have generally explained this through the argument that earlier, less refined examples existed but have not survived. That argument is logically possible. Evidence does not always survive, but it is an inference, not a finding. It fills a gap by assuming something that has not been demonstrated. And when the same type of gap appears in multiple traditions, requiring the same type of unsupported inference to fill it, the cumulative weight of those inferences becomes a problem. At some point, repeatedly filling the same kind of gap with the same kind of assumption begins to look less like explanation and more like avoidance. However, the timeline does not fully match, and that mismatch has not been addressed at the level of depth the evidence requires. The structural optimization question adds another layer that the standard account has not absorbed. Modern structural analysis of certain ancient ceiling forms has found that the shapes used closely approach mathematical optimality. That is, they distribute structural load in ways that formal engineering mathematics would recognize as highly efficient. The standard response is intuitive knowledge developed through trial and error. Some version of that explanation is almost certainly true for part of the story, but the precision of the optimization in specific structures and the absence of the failed attempt evidence that genuine trial and error learning generates leaves the explanation incomplete in specific and measurable ways. It doesn't fully make sense that a process of learning through failure would consistently produce results this close to the mathematical optimum without leaving more evidence of the failures along the way. The cross-cultural correspondence question remains the most difficult to place within the standard framework. Specific proportional relationships and geometric systems appear across traditions that had limited documented contact with each other. General similarity can be explained by universal geometry, but specific mathematical correspondences in the underlying proportional frameworks of the designs, not just their visual appearance, require something more, either contact of a type not well documented, or a common source of geometric knowledge that predates the individual traditions, or a process of independent development that produced identical specific results by coincidence. None of these explanations is clearly supported by direct evidence. None has been established, and none has been ruled out. The correspondence is in the structures. Its explanation is not yet in the record. And then there's the broader knowledge question, the one that emerged when the investigation expanded beyond the ceilings themselves to include the astronomical alignments, the mathematical encodings, and the integrated planning visible in the structures as whole systems. These features together suggest that the builders of certain ceilings were working with a body of knowledge that was not limited to construction technique. They were integrating architecture, geometry, mathematics, and astronomical observation into a single coordinated design practice. The scope of that integration has not been fully acknowledged in the standard historical account, and the question of how it was organized, transmitted, and sustained has not been clearly answered. Some believe the answer lies in institutions whose knowledge has been lost. Others believe it lies in a mathematical tradition whose early sophistication has been underestimated. Others point to cultural exchange networks whose full extent has not been mapped. None of these answers is complete, and this is where the explanation becomes difficult in the most fundamental sense, because the question being asked is larger than any of the current answers can accommodate. It is worth pausing here to consider what kind of uncertainty this actually is. There are different kinds of unanswered questions in historical research. Some questions are unanswered because the evidence to answer them does not exist and cannot reasonably be expected to exist. The record is simply too incomplete. Some questions are unanswered because they have not yet been asked clearly enough or studied thoroughly enough, even though the evidence to answer them may exist in principle. And some questions are unanswered because answering them would require revising frameworks that are well established and widely accepted, which creates institutional resistance even when the evidence points in a clear direction. The questions surrounding these ceilings appear to fall across more than one of these categories. Some of the missing evidence may genuinely be unrecoverable. Some of the questions may not have been studied with sufficient focus and specificity, and some of the implications may be uncomfortable enough for existing frameworks that they have been underexamined. Distinguishing between these possibilities is itself a task that has not been fully carried out. What is not the case, and this is worth stating clearly, is that the questions are unanswered because the answer is hidden or deliberately suppressed. There is no evidence for that kind of active concealment. The gaps in the explanation are not the result of anyone withholding information. They are the result of research that has not yet gone far enough, questions that have not yet been asked precisely enough, and frameworks that have not yet been revised to accommodate observations that don't fit cleanly within them. That is a very different kind of problem from suppression. It is a problem of incomplete investigation, and incomplete investigation is something that further research can, in principle, address. The question is whether the research community will turn sufficient attention to these specific gaps, with sufficient methodological rigor, to produce the kind of direct evidence that would actually begin to close them. The structures themselves remain the most important piece of evidence in this investigation. They have survived for centuries. In many cases, they are still standing, still accessible, still measurable. The precision in them is not a matter of interpretation. It can be quantified. The structural optimization is not a theoretical claim. It can be calculated. The mathematical content of the designs is not an impression. It can be analyzed. And the cross-cultural correspondences are not a feeling. They can be documented. All of this evidence is physical, durable, and available for continued study. What has been lacking is not the evidence. What has been lacking is a sufficiently systematic and integrated approach to examining it, one that treats the ceilings not as isolated decorative objects, but as what they actually are, the physical record of a knowledge tradition whose full dimensions have not yet been mapped. Some believe that the next significant advance in understanding these structures will come from closer collaboration between architectural historians, structural engineers, mathematicians, and astronomers. A genuinely interdisciplinary approach that treats the integrated knowledge visible in the structures as the central object of study, rather than a side observation. Others believe that advances in digital measurement and analysis will make it possible to document the precision and geometric content of these structures at a level of detail that was not previously achievable, and that this more detailed documentation will reveal patterns that current analysis has missed. Both possibilities are plausible. Neither has yet been realized at the scale the question requires, and until one or both of them produces results that the research community can examine and debate, the questions will remain where they are. This is, ultimately, an investigation that has arrived at a clear and honest destination. Not an answer, but a well-defined open question. The observation that started this examination was simple. Something about these old ceilings doesn't fully match the official explanation. After looking carefully at the construction, the precision, the engineering, the timelines, the cross-cultural patterns, the astronomical alignments, the mathematical content, and the alternative interpretations, that original observation has not been dismissed. It has been confirmed as real, documented as specific, and shown to be consistent across multiple structures, multiple traditions, and multiple types of analysis. The gap between the official explanation and the physical evidence is not large. It is not dramatic, but it is persistent. And persistent gaps in well-studied subjects are usually pointing toward something that hasn't been looked at closely enough yet. What that something is remains to be established. The investigation has identified where it is not. It is not in the broad strokes of the official account, which are sound. It is in the specific details. The details of execution, the details of knowledge organization, the details of transmission across time and across cultures. Those details are where the current explanation grows thin. And thin explanations, when the evidence they are trying to cover is as durable and measurable as these ceilings are, tend not to hold indefinitely. At some point, the specificity and consistency of what the structures actually show will require a more specific and consistent account of how and why they came to be the way they are. That account has not yet been written, and until it is, something about these old ceilings remains, quietly and persistently, not fully explained.